So it's interesting because I started researching my book in 2010, and at that point, effective altruism had really not gotten started as a movement. I know Giving What We Can had been founded in 2009, but that was in England. And when I started writing about two people you may have know about, Julia Wise and Jeff Kaufman, who are based in near Boston on the East Coast, they really felt like freaks. They didn't know anyone like them. They'd never heard of Peter Singer, so they didn't even know that there was a philosopher out there who agreed with their way of thinking. And all of that obviously has completely changed just in the last 5 years, which it's been an extraordinary thing to see. And because the movement is still in its early phase, as you know, there's still a lot of what I would call low-hanging moral fruit around, which is to say, there are a lot of people still around like you who think like you, but just haven't heard of effective altruism yet. And you know exactly how to communicate with those people. Mostly young, well-educated, logically minded people who don't find it weird or off-putting to think about charity in terms of rational arguments and empirical research. And so this talk is not about people like that or people like you. But when you go to another phase, a sort of a Menshevik phase, if you move on to that, where you want to include and recruit people who don't think like you to the movement, I think you're going to run into some obstacles. And some of these obstacles you already know about because you have had many of these conversations already. You know that for a lot of people, giving is an emotional business, and arguments about effectiveness can seem not only irrelevant, but even offensive to those kinds of people. You know it can be very difficult to persuade people to stop giving to charities that they've believed in for years, even if you have the numbers to show that they are completely ineffective. And it can be very difficult to get people to compare different kinds of human suffering in terms of money. But there are other obstacles as well. And these obstacles probably will not come up in these conversations that you're having, because they're so much part of our mainstream moral culture that they're no longer really arguments. They're no longer visible as points about which you can agree and disagree. They've just become part of the background. And because of that, because they're beliefs that people don't even realize that they hold, they exist on the level of gut feeling and taste, and so they can exert a strong influence on the ethics that people live by without anyone even realizing it. So here's the question that I set out to answer, one of the questions I set out to answer in my book, which is, why don't people give more? And as I'm sure I don't need to tell you, this is a genuine puzzle because giving makes you happy, as everybody knows. And even if you don't believe, as EAs do, that you owe a large portion of what you have to others, giving something away often makes you happier than keeping it. And this is something that everybody knows. So why don't people give more? And the usual answer that you hear is that we're human, we're selfish, we like our stuff too much to give it up, and of course that's all true. And you also hear more sophisticated arguments, especially applied to foreign aid, such as foreign aid often backfires, it doesn't work very well, it sometimes even harms the people in the countries it's trying to help, and that's very dispiriting. And even if it didn't actively do harm sometimes, poverty and injustice can seem so enormous that giving can feel futile. But I don't think that these ordinary arguments are the whole story. So one reason for living an ethical life is to do something, usually these days to help other people. And another reason is to be something, to become a certain sort of person yourself. And what I want to focus on is how in the past couple of hundred years, but especially in the 20th century, both these things have come under especially hostile scrutiny. First, it came to seem that helping people was much more difficult and liable to backfire than it had previously been thought. And then the motives for helping people had come to seem much more complicated and suspect than they had before. The result is that living an ethical life has come to seem a lot less appealing, or at least less straightforwardly so, than it once did. So yes, people are weak and selfish and lazy, but there are powerful forces that push against living an ethical life that have nothing to do with any of those things. And they're pervasive enough that to write off people who are susceptible to them is to write off a significant part of our culture. In a 1982 essay, Moral Saints, the philosopher Susan Wolf argued that a morally perfect person would be an unappealing, humorless, narrow creature driven not by the loves and delights of ordinary people, but by an unnatural devotion to duty. And George Orwell in the 1940s, when he was reviewing Gandhi's autobiography, wrote, "The essence of being human is that one does not seek perfection, that one is sometimes willing to commit sins for the sake of loyalty, that one does not push asceticism to the point where it makes friendly intercourse impossible, and that one is prepared in the end to be defeated and broken up by life, which is the inevitable price of fastening one's love upon other human individuals. It is too readily assumed that the ordinary man only rejects saintliness because it is too difficult. In other words, that the average human being is a failed saint. It is doubtful whether this is true. Many people genuinely do not wish to be saints, and it is probable that some who achieve or aspire to sainthood have never felt much temptation to be human beings." So in setting saints against human beings, Orwell makes it seem that to pursue moral goodness in an ambitious way is to reject other people, to turn away from human fellowship and love. And these thoughts are not unique to Woolf and Orwell. Skeptical, even hostile ideas about morally minded people are commonplace, as you've probably encountered. When I was working on this book project, it was incredible. Something like half the people I spoke to, friends, people I would meet at parties, said, "Oh, those moral people, they're all mentally ill, right?" And I would say, "Well, no, but how interesting, you would think that." And notions like this are one of the reasons that trying to become even a slightly better person has become so unattractive. So how did these ideas arise in the first place? I'm going to sketch a very rough history for you of some of the landmarks, I think, that have contributed to this set of beliefs that now exist in our moral culture. There are many others, but these are just some of the main ones, I think. So it was never a new idea that people are selfish. And it was not, nor was it ever new to suggest that when people appeared to be doing good things, they were either secret hypocrites or they were doing them for selfish reasons. But the idea that took longer to emerge was that even when people were genuinely doing good things and doing them for impeccable reasons, that there was still a problem. For instance, in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith argued that a man pursuing his own selfish ends, in combination with many others doing the same thing, could end up working as effectively for the public good as if he was doing so on purpose, possibly even more so. He intends only his own gain, Smith wrote, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Smith actually only used the word invisible hand once in the whole book, in passing. But this metaphor proved so resonant and so enduringly popular that it came to stand for something much larger. It implanted deep in Western culture the idea that individual selfishness could be beneficial for society as a whole, which in turn suggested that if the moral goal were helping others, as opposed to self-perfection, a selfish person might do better than a selfless one. Not long after The Wealth of Nations was published came the French Revolution, and after that came the Terror. The revolutionary leader Robespierre became known both for his moral purity and for his extraordinary violence. And partly through him, the two became associated permanently. And after the communist revolution in Russia reinforced this association, it became impossible to see a man who believed he knew about how to bring about a better world and was prepared to sacrifice himself for it without thinking of death. A century after The Wealth of Nations, Darwin's Origin of the Species introduced the idea that the selfish struggle for survival was the basis of life itself. Now, Darwin himself did not believe this. He believed that altruistic communities were going to defeat non-altruistic communities because people who cooperated would prosper more than people who didn't. But to many who believed in the basic Darwinian scheme, this seemed unconvincing and contrived. And for decades after Darwin, pretty much almost the whole 20th century, seemingly altruistic behavior was explained away by biologists as kin selection or reciprocal altruism. In other words, altruism, whatever seemed to be altruism, was actually just selfishness in disguise. So the idea that selfishness might produce better results than selflessness came first. But it was followed in the 20th century by the idea that trying to help other people might not be only ineffective, but it was something even more insidious, something twisted, something aggressive, something perverse. So this, for instance, I mean, there are many examples of this, but one particularly resonant one is this 1925 book, The Gift, by the French anthropologist Marcel Mauss. He argued that giving in the ancient societies that he studies was never quite what it purported to be. Giving in those societies was always reciprocal. Giving without the expectation of getting something in return was not thought to be a higher, more selfless act, as people sometimes think of it now. On the contrary, then it was aggressive. It caused the recipient to lose face. It imposed on him a burden of gratitude. And in some societies, a gift retained rather than passed along could cause serious harm to the recipient, it was believed, even death. In some ancient languages, Mauss found, the word gift had a second meaning, poison. To Freud, an excess of virtue suggested what he called moral masochism, and this view set the tone in psychoanalysis and psychology for decades. Anna Freud was even more suspicious than her father had been. She coined the term altruistic surrender to describe the perverse state of a person who was unable to gratify his own wishes except through a proxy, through somebody else. But then by the end of the millennium, and this is very striking, and I'm not sure why this was so, something did change, particularly in psychology and sociology. Social scientists started to think that their century-long commitment to humans being thoroughly degraded was a little strange. And even in economics, the assumption of rational self-interest began to bend. Economists had long assumed that there would be a free rider problem with respect to public goods. If people could partake in public goods without paying for them, they would. But then a number of studies showed that this was true only if the subjects were economists. So for much of the 20th century then, altruism was regarded in the human sciences with deep suspicion and usually taken to be a form of selfishness in disguise. But this suspicion of altruists existed not only in an intellectual culture, but in popular culture as well. In the 1930s, Alcoholics Anonymous popularized the idea that what had once been a sin, drunkenness, was actually a disease. And then a couple of decades later, Al-Anon, which was started by the spouses of alcoholics, spread the idea that what had once been a virtue, trying to get a drunk to stop drinking, was a symptom of the same disease. And these were both radical innovations, but the second one had farther-reaching moral effects. Because, if alcoholism is a sin or a disease, either way it's something bad that you want to get rid of. But if certain kinds of helping, especially the tormented, entangled helping of an alcoholic spouse, were also bad, then that made a whole realm of moral behavior look very strange and different. And over the decades that followed, this founding idea of Al-Anon, but this was the decade of Gordon Gekko and Wall Street and the me generation and all of that stuff. And so, a lot of historical forces were converging on this idea that there was something more natural, more healthy about selfishness, and that morality came to look more and more weird and perverse. And the logic of codependency, the reason it's so insidious, is that it suggests that helping, any kind of helping, not just the spouse of the alcoholic, is always a disease because the codependent is not free. They may think that they had chose to become a therapist or chose to help because they had a choice, but in fact they had no choice because they felt obliged, they felt guilty if they did not help, they had to help. And then the question occurs to me, is the codependent, therefore, even accepting that premise, wrong to feel that way? So is she, when she feels responsible for helping other people, is she making a mistake? Suppose a person, and I like to think about it, suppose we take their premise to be true. Suppose you have a codependent person who grew up feeling like they were obliged to help because they grew up in this terrible family that damaged them in the ways that Beatty and Norwood describe, and they grew up feeling guilty and that they had to help. But then take another person who grew up in a wonderful family, who grew up with an equal sense of obligation because their parents, their good parents, told them this was what they had to do in life. Is one urge any more true or free than the other? That's what I wonder. So by the middle years of the 20th century then, a loosely related set of ideas about morality had established themselves. That selfishness sometimes brings about more good than altruism, that altruism is often just selfishness in disguise, and sometimes can be unconsciously hostile and can be a disease as ruinous as addiction. But the realm in which the altruist has been attacked most effectively and relentlessly is in fiction, in novels. Here the charge is that moral commitment to people in general undermines love for people in particular. There is a sense, often in fiction, that the more a character cares for people far away, the less he will love people close to him, and the more he will feel himself removed from human life. It's in novels that the case against altruists, their spiritual hubris, their distance from ordinary life, is made most moving and powerful. And this is odd because a lot of novelists are driven by moral rage. But it seems that most novelists, rather than showing a character trying to fix the problem, would rather just show the problem in all its brutality. And many of the there are, of course, many singularly good characters in fiction, but most of them are innocents rather than altruists, like the holy fool Prince Mishkin in Dostoevsky's The Idiot. I don't know if you've read that. But the ones who do have a real moral ambition, who do set out self-consciously to be altruists, usually have a crucial flaw that ensures that no one can take them seriously. Either they're personally repellent, like Walter in Jonathan Franzen's Freedom, or they're well-meaning but ineffective, like Miss Birdseye in The Bostonians, or they're weak and die young, like George Bernanos' Country Priest. Or else they're so completely ridiculous that they make nonsense of altruism altogether, like Mrs. Jellyby in Bleak House. You could say that altruists are pretty rare figures in life, and so their rarity in realistic fiction is not surprising. But while in life they're unusual, it's really striking. In fiction, they are almost non-existent. So real people may be bad, but fictional people are much worse. There are exceptions, like the heroic doctor in Rieu in Albert Camus' novel The Plague, but it's striking that many of these exceptionally good characters that you find go out of their way to denigrate altruism for its own sake and to deny that that's what they're doing. There's no question of heroism in all this, Rieu says. It consists in doing my job. Characters also whose emotions are stirred by ideals as much as people are never to be trusted in fiction. A character who's any kind of theorist or philosopher is likely to be deplored either for foolish unworldliness or, if he is successful, for violence. Wise characters are devoted to the complex, to the particular, and most of all, through love to the individual person. There are some few fiction writers who reject this ethos, and probably the best known is Tolstoy, though he actually began as the opposite. He began as an aesthete who wrote, "The aims of art are incommensurate with social aims." This is what he believed as a younger man. "The aim of an artist is not to solve a problem, but to make people love life in all its countless inexhaustible manifestations." When he began to write Anna Karenina, this was this sort of hinge work where he was moving from that point of view to a point of view that actually the only purpose of he reversed himself completely. The only purpose of novels was to solve social problems. And because Anna Karenina, he felt, did not do that, he only finished it reluctantly. He came to loathe the novel as he was writing it and only finished it because he was obliged to. But earlier on, when he introduced Levin, he was still thinking that some kind of social aims were okay to include in fiction, but he was still suspicious of them. He wrote, those of you who have read it, you all should read it, will remember the character of Levin. And he wrote, "Levin looked on his half-brother as a man of enormous intellect and education, who was noble in the loftiest sense of the word, and had the gift of being able to work for the common welfare. But in the depths of his soul, the older Levin got, and the better he came to know his brother, the more often the thought came into his head that this capacity of working for the common welfare, which he felt himself to be completely devoid of, was not so much as a quality as the contrary, a lack of something, a lack of some vital force, of what is called heart, of that impulse that forces a man to choose, out of the countless ways of life presented to him, just one, and to desire that one alone." So this is obviously the very opposite of the EA ethos, and that is really how almost every fiction writer who deals with the question of morality at all will come down. In the service of his new belief that novels ought to solve social problems, he decided to write a book attacking Shakespeare, because he felt that Shakespeare exemplified this literary ethos, a kind of amoral acceptance of the human condition. In Shakespeare's world, Tolstoy felt, there were no true moral principles. Human life in its infinite complexity did not admit of certitude. The only thing one could be reasonably sure of was that moderation was good, aspiration was bad, or ridiculous, and if you behaved more or less like everybody else, you wouldn't go far wrong. Excessive generosity ruins Timon, Tolstoy wrote, while Antonio's moderate generosity confers honor. Shakespeare taught that one could be too good. Among the more startling moments in Tolstoy's railing against Shakespeare was his claim that Uncle Tom's Cabin was a greater work than any Shakespeare play because it flowed from the love of God and man. Now, Uncle Tom's Cabin, this was very scandalous because Uncle Tom's Cabin is a very lowbrow book, a sentimental bestseller who even the people who love it do not usually defend its literary merits. But if Tolstoy was going to make an argument against this literary ethos, which he took Shakespeare to exemplify, the way to do it was with a lowbrow bestseller, because in lowbrow novels, this anti-moralizing ethos did not apply. And this is, in fact, one of the qualities that defines them as lowbrow, and these are the exceptions to this general rule that I'm sketching about fiction. To be expressly moral, to draw explicit morals and explicitly moral characters lowers a novel's genre so that it becomes lowbrow. And it's one of the things that defines a novel as a work of literature, that it opposes any kind of simplistic or any kind of moral certainty. So to conclude, what is the upshot of all this? What are its implications for EA? Just that, as I said at the beginning, if you want to spread your ideas to a broader audience, you need to know what you're up against. There exists in our moral culture now a complex of ideas that add up to a profound suspicion of altruism. Not just effectiveness, you know about that, but altruism as such. The idea that a population of people working in their own self-interest may bring about more good than a population of altruists, that giving can be a hostile act, and attempting to help other people may be a twisted form of selfishness, or actually a kind of helpless addiction, that serious altruists are alienated from ordinary human life, and that a person who cares about strangers far away is likely to care less for people close to him. And it may be that none of these ideas are true, but they exist. And so when you talk to people about giving, they are there in the air between you. They may be invisible and even unthought of, but they're there nonetheless. Thanks.